It was nearly 70 years ago now, but I remember it as if it was only yesterday. It was a beautiful summer morning. And as a child, Minnesota summers were absolutely paradise to me. The cool mornings and warm afternoons, all the time in the world. Time slowed down as in a dream. Playing baseball in the street, walking to the park to play tetherball and battleship, and weave Indian bracelets out of colored plastic strips. Playing King of the Hill on high mounds of dirt in vacant lots where basements were being dug for new homes. Playing cowboys and Indians, galloping on imaginary horses until called in for dinner, then back out into the evening to ride bicycles or chase fireflies or wait for the ice cream truck with its bell ringing, bringing banana popsicles or orange dreamsicles, just for a nickel. Then suddenly, one beautiful morning, all that changed. To a casual observer, everything would have looked the same, but nothing would ever be quite the same again. I was in our single-car garage with its one-piece metal door that stuck straight out when up. I was building something when the boy who lived across the street walked up the driveway. He was a year older and bigger than me and often bullied me. I didn't like that, but his parents owned the only television on the block, and if I wanted to watch The Lone Ranger, I had to put up with his bullying. We had quarreled the previous day, and I had not been invited to watch The Lone Ranger, and so when he walked up the driveway and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Yes, you are. You're making something." I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Yes, you are, and I'm going to come in and find out for myself." And I said, "You better not." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I'll close the garage door right on your head." And he said, "You wouldn't dare." And I said, "You just try it." And he did. He took a step forward. And as he did, I grabbed the pull rope on the door and yanked it as hard as I could. The door came down and hit him square on the top of the head, knocking him flat to the ground. For a moment, he didn't move, and I was terrified. I thought I'd killed him. Then he began to cry, and I became even more terrified because I thought he was going to start beating me up. But he didn't. He stumbled down the driveway crying and rubbing his head and saying that he was going to tell his father, and his father would beat up my father. So I closed the door and hid in the garage, waiting in fear for him and his dad to come. I thought about saying that it was an accident, or that really it was his fault. Anything that would save me from what was to come. But he and his dad never appeared. The next afternoon, I was back at his house watching The Lone Ranger in black and white. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same again. Because hiding in that garage, I realized something. Even though a part of me felt bad about what happened, another part felt real good. I had wanted him to take that fateful step forward. I had wanted to hit him with that garage door, and I enjoyed it. I had wanted it. And when we got together later that afternoon and made up, I really didn't mean it. I just wanted to watch The Lone Ranger. So in a few brief moments, on a beautiful Minnesota summer morning, paradise was lost forever. The innocence of childhood was lost. I now knew I was capable of hurting somebody, meant to hurt someone, even enjoyed it, and new and uncomfortable feelings entered my world. And while childhood was far from over and there would be more carefree, wonderful, glorious summers to come, I could never again regain paradise, could never undo what I had done, nor forget, because he still lived across the street. And every time I saw him, I was reminded of who I now knew myself to be and all I had to live with. And what I didn't know then, I know now. That one beautiful summer day, I played out the ancient story of Adam and Eve all over again. A story that's been played out by every human being since human beings first drew breath. For a moment, forget everything you think you know about that story. Forget how you were first taught it, what you think is there, what it means. Forget any notion of the fall or original sin. There's no mention of such things in the story. And don't go looking for Satan in the story. You won't find him. All those interpretations came later in an attempt to make sense of the story. Oh, and don't worry about whether Adam and Eve were really the first human beings. You'll only give yourself a raging headache trying to figure out where the wives of their husbands came from. Rather, take the story as it was told. A story about God and what it means to be a human being. A story about choice and consequence. When we hear it like that, the story comes alive, and we realize it's a story about all of us. A story about the foolish act that cost the job or shattered the relationship, the rash decision that nearly ruined our lives. Those times when we figured we knew better than everybody else. When our pride or arrogance or curiosity got the better of us and we did some really stupid things. And so it's a story about tragic and painful consequences. All that is suddenly lost. Of course, the story tells us much about how we go wrong, how we make such a mess of things, but I have a feeling that most of us don't need the story to tell us that. Most of us already know all about that. Most of us do a bang-up job reminding ourselves of our foolishness and rashness, our stupidity and arrogance. We replay the disastrous choices again and again, rehearse the miserable decisions over and over, torture ourselves with the memory of what we did. That's not what we need help with. What we need help with is something else. One author has said that what she wants to know is, how do you go on once you've lost paradise? How do you fashion a future out of a sorry past? How do you survive the consequences and live with yourself and what you brought down on your own head? Adam and Eve didn't die. They had to go on living. And what the author wants to know is, how'd they do it? And that is the question. Because that's where we find ourselves, where we live. We live east of Eden, beyond paradise, in the land of consequences, to where our choices have brought us. And there's no going back. The story is clear about that. Like Adam and Eve, we always find ourselves losing paradise, not just the innocence of childhood, but the paradise of a career or job we've enjoyed, a relationship, losing what has been good, and finding ourselves in a new and strange world. And how do you survive such a thing? Such losses? How do we live with ourselves? The consequences. Fashion a new future. Well, there are ways. And as in this ancient story of Adam and Eve, so too in our stories. One way to try to survive is cover it up. Hide from God, hide from ourselves. But finally we can't hide from God or hide from the face that stares back at us from the mirror every morning. Sooner or later, the pretense fails. So we can try to be perfect instead. We put ourselves under immense pressure, never to make a mistake, never fail, in the hope of regaining paradise. But we cannot undo what we have done. There's no going back. And perfection will never be ours, no matter how hard we try. So we can blame others, punish ourselves, keep track of every failure and mistake in the hope we can atone for what we have done. But usually all we accomplish is to paralyze ourselves with guilt and fear until we hardly live at all. Or we can blame others, Be angry with rather than guilty. Be a victim and wait for others to repair what has been ruined, since they're the ones who did it. Or we can blame God. Be angry at God. Wait for God to fix everything for us. And when you read the whole story of Adam and Eve, you'll find most all of it there. All the ways we try to survive the consequences of our choices. But there's another way. The author I mentioned earlier has told one of the legends about Adam and Eve that never made it into the Bible. There were many such legends about what happened to them, and they have a ring of truth about them. Now, according to this one legend, God gave Adam and Eve a cave to live in, just east of Eden, where they sat in shock for many months after their eviction from paradise, reciting every detail they could remember to each other. The shade of the trees, the warmth of the sun, the beauty of the land. Eve offered to kill herself if God would just let Adam back into the garden alone. But Adam wouldn't hear of it, although he tried to end his own life soon after by jumping off a cliff. When both of them had failed to die, they wept and beat their breasts, and together begged God to let them return to Eden. But God said, with enormous divine sadness, that it was impossible. Instead, he sent angels to sing to them and sprinkle water on them to cool them. He reconciled the beasts of the earth to them, telling the animals to be gentle with them. But Adam and Eve could not be roused from their despair. For 83 days they languished, refusing all food and drink for fear they would sin again. God gave them a fountain of living water to drink, but took it back when they tried to drown themselves in it. He sent them figs from the garden to eat, as big as watermelons, but they left them for the crows. Finally, when their bodies were stained from exposure, and they were speechless from heat and cold, Adam and Eve let God teach them how to sew, using thorns for needles and sheepskins to make shirts for themselves to cover their nakedness. Having lost paradise, having run out of bushes and alibis to hide behind, having all but killed themselves through guilt and exposure, Adam and Eve decided to let God clothe them. Fear not, an angel sang to them in that night, the God who created you will strengthen you. And so God did. And Adam and Eve decided to live. The days of peace and plenty were gone for good, but they got by. Using all the scraps at hand, they managed to build first an altar and then a home, to bake bread from the wild wheat of the field and to bear 5 children. Using the pieces of their broken past, they made a future for themselves and for their descendants in the world outside Eden. And that's the other way to survive. To live through the loss of whatever paradise we have lost. To live with ourselves. To allow God to clothe and strengthen us. To stop looking back at the paradise we can never regain. And allow God to fashion a future out of broken pieces and shattered remnants. To live with our brokenness and frailties and put a life together in the world as it is. And it's a choice we always can make in the power of Christ. On this first Sunday in Lent, we begin to think about Jesus heading toward Jerusalem and a cross. And one thing the cross proclaims is that God is willing to work with broken pieces and calls us to do the same. That God has the power to mend and heal what is broken and shattered. And yes, the cracks will always show. There will always be reminders of our brokenness and frailty, but reminders too of the God who has mended us and strengthened us and who will continue to mend us and strengthen us again and again. What the cross proclaims is that our wholeness is not behind us, but ahead of us in the power of God, who raised Christ unto life, and shall raise us up also. And in that power, we can put our lives back together with hope, and with courage, and with gladness. You know, now and then I still think of that beautiful summer day, so many years ago, and the day paradise was lost. And I smile and thank God, whom I've kept rather busy in the years since, with a great deal of mending and repair work. The God who works with broken pieces and who gives us the strength to do the same. Amen.